Most Americans don't know Delaware. It's a blur from the Metroliner streaking between Washington and New York. It's just another stretch of highway between Maryland and Pennsylvania. But turn off the interstate for a moment, and you'll discover what Jefferson called a jewel among states, because he said there was so much of value in something so small.
Down here in Delaware, which is a northern state with a southern exposure, you might say, makes for a lot of good living.
It's a quiet little state.
The climate here is beautiful.
People know the politicians a little bit more personally because it's such a small place.
I like the compactness of the state. You can almost get up in the morning and jog around the state. It's neat.
What I think is interesting about Delaware is the fact that it's a combination of many things, not just the bucolic countryside and the pretty trees and so forth. There's industry here, there's people, and that's rather fascinating. That, I hope, goes into my painting. So when I paint a pig, let's say, I mean, I'm thinking of Interstate 495, which makes it sort of interesting.
Small wonder. That's what the Tourist Bureau calls Delaware. And perhaps the biggest wonder of all is that it became a state in the first place. Its other nickname reminds us of its place when the nation was young. And as the United States has grown, tiny Delaware has been part of its upheavals and achievements. The American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, freedom for people, freedom to worship. And throughout it all, we have preserved the traditional American values. This is Delaware's heritage. Come discover it as we celebrate the first state.
Major funding for Celebrate the First State was provided by the Delaware Heritage Commission and by ICI Americas, growth based on science and technology. Additional funding was provided by Wilmington Trust Company.
Like so much of America, Delaware's early history was shaped by its water. These satellite photographs show the river and bay that define the state's eastern shore. They were named over 300 years ago by a sailor from Virginia who was coming back
from England with supplies, with more food, and he was blown off course by a great southerly gale, and he landed at the mouth of a river that, as far as he knew, had no name. And in honor of his governor, Lord Delaware, and that's my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, 200 miles to the south, he called it the Delaware River. And that's the first time that the name Delaware arrived here.
Shortly afterwards, the first immigrants to settle in Delaware landed in Lewis, about a mile from where the ferry from New Jersey docks today. Later, other immigrants sailed up the Delaware coast, where Native Americans lived and fished. And still later, at a spot where the river narrows and the waters are more calm, there grew up the first great port at which foreign settlers could land, the town of Newcastle. Once the seat of government for the lower counties on the Delaware, as the colony was called, Newcastle is now a peaceful little town that echoes with voices from the past. Its quiet streets belie its hectic, sometimes violent early years. These flags that hang over the old courthouse steps tell the story. Founded by the Dutch, Newcastle was conquered by the Swedes, then reclaimed by the Dutch before the British took the town. They ruled for just over a century, until Delaware broke the ties that bound them to the crown. Today, a race around the town takes us past the memories of early conquerors. The first immigrants, the Dutch, found only wilderness here. They built the town one house at a time. This one still remains. In the early days, the most important street in town was Packet Alley. It takes its name from the ships, which disembarked their passengers here to seek their fortunes or their freedom. Peter Stuyvesant landed here and stayed long enough to lay out the town in pretty much the same way as it looks today. And at the site of the old courthouse, William Penn first claimed his lands in the New World. But the Royal Charter had a curious provision. His holdings in Pennsylvania could extend no nearer than 12 miles to Newcastle. So the cupola on top of the old courthouse became the center of an arc that defines the boundaries of northern Delaware to this day. William Penn is still remembered in Delaware, for he was the governor who allowed the colony a measure of independence. Newcastle became the seat of government for Delaware 70 years before the American Revolution. And it was here on June 15, 1776, that the Assembly declared Delaware free from the rule of England. To this day, Newcastle celebrates June 15th as Separation Day. The first Separation Day in Newcastle passed unobserved by most colonists who were too busy with the work of making a living. But 1776 was a pivotal year, not just for the colonies, but for the men who were struggling to create a new nation. One such man was John Dickinson, whose contribution to American history is celebrated each year on his plantation here in Kent County.
You know what? I don't know anything about John Dickinson. Poor guy.
He was a representative of Delaware and signed something, didn't he?
He was one of the first people to free his slaves back in 1700. And as a result, the other Quakers here in the area followed suit.
I know he was a patriot who probably got a raw deal for some of his ideas.
In 1776, the name Dickinson was well known throughout the colonies. His earlier writings protesting the unfairness of taxation by England had been widely published and read by attorneys and artisans alike. These carefully reasoned letters earned him the nickname Penman of the Revolution, and might have won him a place in history with Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, but for a crucial episode which occurred on July 4th, 1776.
If you've ever seen the Broadway musical 1776, you'll find that people may get a bad idea of John Dickinson because he did not support the Declaration of Independence. He was for finding more peaceful ways of getting along with England, whereas the other patriots were for breaking away. And he walked out of the convention.
Disgraced, Dickinson retreated here to his plantation, bitter over his lost reputation. But after the Revolutionary War, Americans began to squabble among themselves about the way in which the country should be governed. Dickinson's voice of reason was heard again. In 1787, he found himself in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, arguing for equal rights for the smaller states in a national government. After a long, hot summer of debate, it was agreed. Delegates to the House of Representatives would be elected according to a state's population. In the Senate, however, each state would have 2 seats. In September 1787, the delegates signed and the Constitution went before the people. Ironically, John Dickinson had returned home sick, so his name was signed by George Read. In Delaware, 30 delegates met in Dover and came to consensus in only 5 days. It was December 7th, 1787. Delaware had become the first state. In doing so, it gave a clear message to the other 12 that it was time to put aside local differences for the common good of the United States of America. Meanwhile, at Barrett's Chapel in Kent County, another revolution was taking place, this one of a spiritual nature. In 1778, these two men, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, met and declared their independence from the Church of England. A new religion was born, American Methodism.
Here are the words of the gospel written by St. Mark. Methodism has always been an emotional religion. How do you feel about things? And the kind of free spirit, pioneering spirit, the kind of spirit that's still there among the watermen of this area, among the farming communities of this area, is the kind of spirit that Methodism brought. That said, I don't care what you think, I don't care what your religious beliefs are. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Your heartbeat is my heart. Give me your hand. He took them up in his arms, put his hands upon them, and blessed them. What name shall be given this child?
Richard Seamus.
Richard Seamus. I baptize you in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us pray. It's most fitting to have a baptism in a chapel 200 years old. As this chapel, as Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury stood in front of that altar and made some pledges to each other and did some planning about giving birth to a religion in this country, a denomination in this country. To have the opportunity to stand on that same little star at the altar and to hold your grandson and to give his life to God, as it were, in baptism, is very meaningful to me as the person who did it, to me as the grandfather of that child, and I'm sure to our entire family as they gathered and took part in that ceremony.
The gentle hills that roll along the Brandywine Creek in Delaware's northeastern corner have been an inspiration to artists for over a century. But it was the power of the river that made the Brandywine one of the first centers of the American Industrial Revolution. Every year at the Hagley Museum on the Brandywine, they put on a huge fireworks display, which is appropriate because the company that once worked here was responsible for more explosions in America than anyone else during the 19th century. In 1800, a French botanist named DuPont escaped the revolution in France and emigrated to America with his family. Together, they planned to set up an industrial village on the Potomac. But the price of land near the new capital, Washington, was too high. Instead, DuPont drew up these plans for black powder mills on the banks of the Brandywine.
We have three ingredients of black powder. There are charcoal, which was produced locally. There was sulfur, which came from Sicily. And there was saltpeter, which came from India. Now, the three ingredients came into the port of Wilmington and were brought out here in wagons and made into the black powder in the mills that you see behind me here, powered by the water wheel.
The workers who mixed the powder and packed the barrels were mostly immigrants, Some French, some Italian, but mostly Irish.
My daddy was born in Ireland. He left when he was 17. It took him 73 days to come here in a sailboat. When he arrived, he was grateful to get his job at DuPont's.
Many people thought working here was worth the money, but they were scared to work in the powder. There was something fascinating about it, though. It was 6 days, 10 hours a day, worked 9 hours on Saturday. Sunday was observed very well.
For the workers, DuPont built houses next to the mills. And high on the hill overlooking the workplace, in the French manner, he built his own residence, where he could sit on the balcony and shout orders to the workers at the river's edge below.
It was a dangerous business, making gunpowder. That's why only 3 sides of the mills were made of stone. The 4th was made of wood and faced the river. So if a spark ignited the powder, the wooden side exploded into the river, and the other buildings nearby were saved.
I'll never forget the scenes I witnessed from our house right after an explosion. People used to flock down. It was just terrible.
My granddaddy was killed there. My grandmother got a widow's pension, $8 a month and a free house and the right to keep boarders.
Soon after DuPont opened his mills on the Brandywine, an issue that had long festered in the United States was coming to a head: slavery. Like the United States as a whole, Delaware was divided, north versus south. In Sussex County, many landowners kept slaves.
My grandfather, who was born in Delaware, in Seaford, Delaware, Sussex County, he said one day, while talking about what happened during his boyhood days, he said, "My father, your great-grandfather, escaped on the Underground."
The Underground Railroad was the name given to the network of free blacks and abolitionists who helped slaves escape and find their way north to freedom.
I don't know exactly what route my relatives took, whether they came by ship, whether they escaped by foot or whatever, you know, or whether they rode horses. But more or less, I'm inclined to think that they made it by hiding in cornfields or in caves or in perhaps the Quaker Meeting House in Odessa. Here at the small red brick Quaker Meeting House, the loft was used to hide slaves. Perhaps they met Thomas Garrett or members of the black community, the church. I do not know. But I do know the fact that it's documented that my family did escape the Underground Railroad.
The best-known conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, who guided more than 300 fugitives to freedom. And whenever she passed through Wilmington, she stopped at the home of Thomas Garrett, a Quaker iron merchant, who ran the last way station before the Pennsylvania border and freedom. Garrett was revered by the people he helped. Our Moses, they called him. And even today, people meet to celebrate the Underground Railroad at his graveside in the Old Friends Meeting House in Wilmington.
Of course, Harriet Tubman used this area probably more than she used any other. For a combination of things, number one, it was Thomas Garrett's outstanding personality. The man was totally fearless based on the stories that we read about him. But secondly, it was due to the blacks who were living here in Wilmington who were actually helping Thomas Garrett.
And they simply honored him because he was such a tremendous station master on the Underground Railroad. And when he died, they carried his coffin through the streets.
Must have been a moving experience.
I wonder if we would have that same kind of feeling today, you know, about each other, you know, regardless of
race, creed, or color, that you can transcend.
Because Thomas Garrett was certainly was the epitome of a human being in crossing those color barriers.
And liberty is the only way to carry us through. The North Star will lead us and freedom will greet us when we reach the end of the line.
When Thomas Garrett died in 1871, pioneers were already settling the great American West. And whenever they needed to build a railroad, mine a quarry, or settle a town, they used gunpowder. As likely as not, it was DuPont gunpowder, acknowledged to be the best in the United States, and the company prospered. About the turn of the century, 3 DuPont cousins took control of the business and began to build the gigantic diversified corporation which we know today. The 3 were public benefactors as well. Pierre, concerned about Delaware's educational system, spent $6 million of his own dollars to build new schools and facilities. Alfred shamed the state into passing an old age pension act by writing personal checks to elderly Delawareans. And T. Coleman DuPont, this unconventional, dynamic motoring enthusiast, he gave Delaware a road. Coleman's route for the road was visionary. It was to run the length of the state from Wilmington to Selbyville. It was to bypass towns instead of running through them. That way there would be less congestion. His plan for a right-of-way was far-sighted too. The highway would be 200 feet wide, with separate carriageways for cars, electric trolleys, horse-drawn vehicles, and pedestrians. Coleman was convinced that a road would open up the northern markets to farmers in Kent and Sussex counties. And in fits and starts, the highway was built. The completed road was not the vision that Coleman had dreamed, but a conventional 2-lane concrete highway. Even so, it was a triumph of engineering and a commercial success. 3 years after completion, it was being widened, and soon it was carrying more produce to Wilmington and Philadelphia than the railroad. The highway was finished in the same year that a Mrs. Steele started selling young chickens as broilers instead of letting them mature to lay eggs. Today, Sussex County sells more broilers than any other county in the United States.
This is the world's largest fry pan. It is 10 feet in diameter. It weighs 650 pounds not loaded. It has 180 gallons of corn oil in it. We're going to cook 10,000 pieces. There are 800 pieces in there right now.
In the olden days, chicken used to be like a once-a-year specialty.
Yes.
Sunday chicken dinner was a big thing.
You ever hear baby chicks say hello?
No.
What do you say?
Oh, bad.
It used to take about 16 weeks for a chicken to reach an age where it had enough meat on it to be a dinner. Because of Mrs. Steele, the time eventually got shorter and shorter and shorter to now it's just 7 weeks. So it was a delicacy back then. Thanks to her, chicken is now an everyday type of dish.
Now this is not a rooster. Now this is a hen cackling contest. Here we go.
The people here are very hard to please about the chicken. They know it inside and out. They raise it, they eat it constantly, and they know what's going on.
Tastes great. Chickens taste good everywhere, and Delmarva chickens are Delmarvelously good.
20 years ago, life in Sussex County revolved mostly around chickens. Today, a trip to Rehoboth on a summer Saturday shows how much this is changing. More and more people are discovering the beauties of this jewel of a state. They come to visit, and they end up staying. Most residents are optimistic about the future.
And Sussex County is growing primarily because of our waterways and our beaches, and people love to retire here.
Wilmington is growing too. The skyline is changing, and the Christina waterfront is beginning to be reclaimed.
And looking around their waterfront and the ideas the fellows had for that, I can see Wilmington in the near future. It might be 10 or 15 years down the road, But I can see a big waterfront area that's really going to be like an exciting type thing going on. Up by the old Wilson line at the end of Madison Street area. It would be neat if somebody would come back in and just renovate one part of that little area just for a little bit of history to, you know, so we can all remember and our kids can kind of remember stuff like that.
A fresh vitality in Sussex, a new waterfront in Wilmington. This growth is becoming part of the new heritage we will pass on to our children. And in Delaware, because we are slow to give up our traditional values, we will pass these on to our children too.
Get married and move to the country and have children and send them to the same school that you went to. Personally, I went to school here at the Corbett School when I was about 5 when I moved to Odessa, and I can't wait to send my kids there. And I'd like to have my kids follow my footsteps in the fire service. Down here, that's a big thing for all of us, to have our children follow behind us.
Small wonder, small it's true. Small wonder I love you. Being biggest ain't being best. In Delaware you're different from all the rest. Everybody! Small wonder, small it's true. Small wonder I love you. Being biggest ain't being best. In Delaware you're different from all the rest.
Major funding for Celebrate the First State was provided by the Delaware Heritage Commission and by ICI Americas, growth based on science and technology. Additional funding was provided by Wilmington Trust Company.